got a dog joining me. This is Morty. She's my dog. Hey, gang. Welcome to Austin's Book Corner, Book Club, Book Chat. Oh, come on. It's not that boring. Oh, you're leaving now? Okay. I figured it's the holiday season. Might as well dress up and talk a little bit about some gothic horror novels. Let me turn my big collection of Bram Stoker stories. I couldn't find my actual copy of Dracula. Have no idea where it went. I have recently been thinking a lot about staying power, specifically in the context of stories. So why do some stories last and why others just kind of fade into obscurity? Is there a way to predict what stories, novels, TV shows, movies, what have you, will stick around for, 100 plus years, and which ones will just kind of fade into obscurity? And here's a good example. Richard Marsh's The Beetle. It was written back in 1897, the same year actually as Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it actually outperformed Dracula by a pretty wide margin. Both of them came out in the same year, the same cultural moment, and The Beetle ended up stealing the show. But today, Dracula is everywhere. Are you coming back up? Come on. Yeah. You want to talk about The Beetle? So they came out at the same time, same year, same cultural moment, but The Beetle stole the show. But today, Dracula is everywhere. There's movies, TV shows, Halloween costumes. I'm sure somewhere I've got a pair of plastic vampire teeth. The Beetle, most people haven't even heard of it. I know I didn't before the class that I'm making this video for. I kind of want to talk about why The Beetle dominated Victorian England and ultimately why it didn't survive the 20th century. And all in all, how that ties into, because I'm a lit nerd and I like theory, Edward Said's concept of Orientalism. And before you click off the video, yes, this will absolutely involve monsters and empire and a bit of racism, unfortunately, and ultimately late Victorian anxieties. First, The Beetle. It was a huge hit. Immense. It ran, unlike Dracula, as a serialized sensation novel. So it came out every week in the papers, kind of the Victorian equivalent of like a binge-worthy TV show. And readers at the time ate it up. Literary scholar Mina, and I'm going to butcher her last name, Vuohelainen. We're going to call her Mina from now on. She's done some of the most thorough contemporary research on the novel that I could find. And she points out that early reviewers called it surprising and ingenious and full of mystery. It was terrifying. It was horrifying. It captured a generation. Supposedly at the time, and I can attest to this having recently read it, once you started reading it, once you picked it up, you essentially couldn't stop. Meanwhile, Dracula, it was published comparatively quietly. It was a single volume, one book, and it kind of didn't make a whole lot of a splash at the time. Didn't make a whole lot of noise. So from the publishing side of things, The Beetle had every single advantage. It was serialized. There were built-in cliffhangers throughout the novel and throughout its publication. Weekly excitement and a reading public who, due to some recent changes in legislation, education was a big thing. More people could read. More young people could read. There was a public ready to devour a good bit of sensational horror. But popularity at the moment is very different from cultural longevity. So if you haven't read it, here's a very quick, as spoiler-free rundown as I can possibly give. I'm trying not to go too crazy, too heavy on revealing what the book is about. The Beetle centers around this horrifying, shape-shifting Egyptian entity. Sometimes it's male, sometimes it's female, sometimes it's something entirely different. The entirely different thing is a beetle. So this Egyptian entity arrives in London and it's seeking revenge for something against a politician, Paul Lessingham. And while it's there, it hypnotizes people. It invades homes, it steals people's bodies, and it blurs every cultural convention that Victorians would have held dear at the time. This is important because, as Mina and other scholars like Victoria Margery argue, the novel itself directly taps into fears that Britain had about the decline of empire, about foreign influence, and about what contemporary critics call reverse colonization. It's essentially the idea that the colonized might return to overwhelm Britain itself. All of these fears about empire weren't just political. They were cultural. They shaped how Victorians imagined the world beyond Britain's borders. And this is where Edward Said comes in. I think I'm going to put my hair up because this is where I tend to get a little passionate about things. Hold on just a second. Please don't unplug. Okay. Whoop. You come and help me? Are you helping me, dog? Ugh. So, Edward Said's Orientalism argues that Western cultures imagine the East as this mysterious, irrational, seductive, threatening place. Essentially, it's an outward projection of Western anxieties. And the Beetle can almost be seen as a case study in this. Like, think about it. The Beetle is described through the entire novel as the Arab more than it is Egyptian, even though later in the book, Marsh confirms that it's Egyptian. It's like a priest of Isis or whatever. But ultimately, in its Arabness, it is foreign and ancient and unknowable. The power that it holds is mystical and irrational in very explicitly racialized ways. We're talking, it hypnotizes people through ancient Egyptian magics. It turns into a fucking scarab beetle and climbs all up people's bodies while they're hypnotized. Pretty bad. But ultimately, this thing is described as a threat precisely because it is other. We'll definitely come back to this, but there, I think, is some interesting mirroring of the threats that the Beetle poses on British society and some of the other British characters that exist within the novel. But like I said, we'll come back to that. So Said would remind us that this isn't really even about Egypt at all. It's about Britain's idea of Egypt. It's a projection of Britain's fears and fantasies onto a culture which it pretends to understand. At the time, Victorian Britain had a lot of anxieties to project. The empire was massive, but inherently fragile. Britain's tendrils laced all around the known world, but because it had such a wide reach, there were constantly fears of cultural contamination, of racial degeneration, fear ultimately that the center couldn't control the edges. Scholars like Ariel Freed, who published a fantastic article on the Beetle last year, 2024, she points out that the novel itself reflects a ton of different Victorian discourses. We've got race, gender, class, mental instability. Freed uses the term hysterical narration to describe how the book collapses the boundaries between the self and the foreign, sanity and madness. And she shows that Britain is at a point where suddenly it feels very vulnerable. So in this way, the monster in the novel isn't just a monster, it is a metaphor for imperial anxieties. And between all of these imperial anxieties, the Beetle also seems to be obsessed with this idea of an unstable identity, especially in gender. The monster's ability to shift between male and female forms, or at the very least kind of take on the appearance of one or the other. It's a whole thing. Read the book, trust me. This ability for the monster to shift forms would have been incredibly unsettling in a society that depended on such strict gender binaries. In an article titled Orgies of Nameless Horrors, Gender, Orientalism, and Queering of Violence in the Beetle, scholars Harris and Vernoy argue that the novel itself seems to tie gender instability to racial and imperial instability. In other words, the Beetle's shifting body becomes almost a symbol for everything Victorian society feared at the time. Sexual ambiguity, foreignness, loss of control. Ultimately, I think this is one reason why the book's horror was so potent, but it's also a reason why the novel didn't age that well. The fear dictated in the novel relies on the assumptions of gender and race that existed at the time that modern audiences just don't really share anymore, theoretically, and we'll come back to that. Anxieties about foreignness and gender weren't the only fears kind of lurking in the heart of the novel. I would argue that some of the most terrifying, unsettling horror doesn't actually come from the creature of the Beetle at all. So we've talked about how the novel obviously characterizes this creature of the East as the ultimate amalgamation of Victorian fears. But personally, I think there's a more disturbing actor at play within the novel. One of our point of view characters, Sydney Atherton, is a British scientist, kind of high status, hoi polloi kind of dude working on what is essentially a biochemical weapon of mass destruction. It's this gas that could kill an entire populations almost instantly. And he's ostensibly doing this work for the British government. And this, I think, is where the Beetle becomes an even more interesting, compelling novel to analyze, to critique. The novel doesn't just show us Victorians' external fears. It doesn't just show us this external foreign threat. It also shows us the very real possibility of a homegrown British terror at this point in time. So Victorian scholars like Patrick Brantlinger and, once again, Ariel Freed, they all point out that the late century Gothic is obsessed not just with a foreign threat, but with the idea that imperial violence might ricochet back onto the empire itself. In this case, it's not quite reverse colonization as much as what I like to think of as almost a karmic recompense, karmic retribution. Atherton's weapon embodies this fear, this idea that Britain's own scientific progress can be turned horrific. And honestly, if you compare the Beetle's attacks, mesmerism, psychological breakdown, a little bit of good body horror. If you compare all of that to Atherton's invention, the Beetle feels almost like less of a threat. It's the British character who poses the more catastrophic threat to British people, maybe, certainly to the people abroad. The Beetle can affect and hurt individuals. It can hurt one-offs, right? It can threaten norms. But Atherton theoretically has the power to wipe out civilizations. And I don't think that that's accidental. I think that it reflects a deeper cultural anxiety at the time that the real monstrosity might not just come from abroad, but from within the Imperial project itself, from the technologies and the ideologies upon which the empire was founded and continues to thrive. While the novel wants us to fear this Egyptian shapeshifter, it also quietly suggests something infinitely more frightening. The idea that Britain's own pursuit of power might just be the deadliest thing in the story, and that the real monster itself isn't this creature that has just entered the house. The monster has lived here with us for ages. So after all of this, breakdown, I'm willing to bet that for some of you, the Beatles seems lit AF, right? Seems like a great read. Why isn't it still popular? After World War II, I think, the Beetle all but disappeared, save for its appearance on a few 19th century lit nerds' syllabi. This begs the question, why did the Beetle fade into obscurity? I have some theories. First, I think that it's because the horror depicted in the novel is predicated on mostly, and we'll come back to this, outdated fears. Hello, you come to talk about the novel again, Morty?
Hey, Morty, we're talking about the Beetle.
The novel's horror is built on mostly outdated fears. Once the British Empire declined, especially after World War II, the book's racialized panic became less culturally resonant, or perhaps more succinctly, it became kind of problematic. It's kind of uncomfortable to acknowledge the level of racism that exists in the novel as the world becomes more culturally diverse in the Western imagination. I think that's one reason. Reason two, the monster isn't super adaptable. To any good writer or playwright or, television producer, what have you, Dracula can be anything. It can be a metaphor for disease, sexuality, capitalism, xenophobia, technological change. It could be so much. Monster theorist Jack Halberstam writes that Gothic monsters are functionally meaning machines. Dracula is a machine with a lot of gears. The Beetle, it's a machine built for a single job. It's a machine built to embody colonial anxiety. So once that anxiety kind of faded, or at the very least became too problematic to talk about in mixed company, the monster just didn't work anymore. Third, Dracula was a hit in adaptations, stage plays, movies, TV shows. Certainly once it hit the public domain status back in the late or early 90s, I think. You had Bela Lugosi, Abbott and Costello meet Dracula. We could even twist it and talk about its influences. We could talk about Buffy or Twilight or True Blood. Every generation had the ability to kind of redefine and reinvent Dracula in a way that you just kind of couldn't with the Beetle. In fairness, how would you? Aside from all the cultural anxieties that are depicted in the novel, the horror is fundamentally situated in the experiences of the individuals within the novel. We don't have the luxury of sticking some vampire teeth on some hot or not actor and creating this imposing, frightening villain. A director would have to figure out a way to make an audience embody the mind of these hypnotized peoples and make horrifying the fact that they are unable to respond when they're witnessing these horrific things, when this beetle is crawling up them and smells awful and is sticky. Like, these are things that are just mechanically difficult to adapt to the stage or to the screen in a way that Dracula just doesn't share these problems. All that to say, while the Beetle was very much of its moment, Dracula became of every moment. With this comparison, if we were to take a step back, I think that we'd be able to make a bigger point about cultural staying power. We can say that stories tend to endure when their metaphors are flexible, when their themes are able to adapt to ever-changing fears, and when their monsters can be reimagined without losing that core appeal. Yeah? Vampires, right? Yeah. Vampires are going to be vampires, but strange, mesmerizing Beetle, tough. Stories tend to fade when they rely on the prejudices of a specific moment in history, or when their horror depends on fears and bigotry and anxieties which we just kind of no longer share. So in other words, Dracula is able to survive this, cultural shift because it is able to evolve, whereas the Beetle kind of disappeared because it couldn't. All that to say, can we predict which stories will last? Maybe not perfectly though, but we certainly can notice patterns. Stories built on these universal anxieties tend to survive, where stories built on a very specific historical, for lack of a better term, set of prejudices don't. Rediscovering the Beetle today, I don't think that makes it timeless. It means that we're at a point where we're finally ready and willing to kind of look at the fears that it reveals. Fears about empire, about identity, about race, and about the limits of British power. It means we're able to look back and critique those prejudices that didn't just exist back then, but which permeated the culture to an extent where we kind of can't help but see it. These things are in both of these novels, but because the Beetle is so heavily steeped in these anxieties and fears, as I've said a million times, I think that we're able to more readily acknowledge the fact that they exist, and it's easier to kind of critique them at this moment in time, given the amount of historical context that we have. Now, soapbox moment. Ironically or not, I don't know, call me Alanis Morissette, am I right? Ironically enough, while I've mentioned it more times than I care to count in the script for this video, I've said these anxieties are outdated. However, I would argue that we're living in a time where a certain subset of people with very specific agendas are attempting to kind of shift our present cultural landscape by dredging these fears and anxieties up. We live in a time where politicians and talking heads are continuing to beat the drum of these once outdated fears of reverse colonization, of racial degeneration, aka the Great Replacement Theory, as
professional idiots like Tucker Carlson spewed on Fox News and, now in his personal podcast all the time. We're seeing these anxieties about non-normative gender representation coming back up, about immigration, xenophobia, these things that were ideally that went away, but that remained latent in a very small subset of the population. They're being marketed back out to a larger audience in a way that is allowing political pundits and these media authorities and figures to reap the benefits of a very bigoted side of America at the very least. But I think largely the world is starting to turn a little bit more conservative, and it's frightening. But I think that the bonus, one of the great parts about having novels like this, is we can kind of capture this point, I think. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic, but I think that it's worth bringing out these novels that at first blush might feel very outdated or very overtly bigoted. It's nigh impossible not to see it within the book. I think we're at a point where we can bring these out and, maybe I can give this to my very bigoted, racist uncle. I can identify the novel as, this radical form of all of this stuff and use it as a shared talking point, because it's really easy to sit around the Thanksgiving dinner table and talk about how crazy this novel is, and maybe use that as a springboard to kind of try to shift people's points of view and de-radicalize them. Maybe. I don't know. I think it'd work, or at the very least it's worth a try. And novels like The Beetle, I think, are a great mechanism through which to try to do this. Anyway, done with my soapbox. That's basically all I have to say. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for stopping by Austin's Book Corner, Book Club, Book Chat. Let me know. I like ABC. I think it's fun. We'll see if I can get together an animation for the beginning of this video. But thanks for stopping by. Hope you enjoyed. If you did, if you liked it, smash that like button. If, you see a book you want me to talk about, let me know. And yeah, until next time, go read a book. Peace.
That's it, bub. That's it, bub. Yeah.